Hello, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 15 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book discussing the history of political theory from the ancient world to the modern day. This time we are jumping into Republicanism. But before we get into that, I do just want to mention we do have an ongoing t-shirt competition that we mentioned last week. We finally ironed out the details. But the person who leaves us the most interesting review on any podcast platform, I know the good ones for that are Apple Podcasts, Podcast Republic. Those are just two that are very easy for us to see the reviews. Leave us a review there, and you'll be entered into our competition to win a free t-shirt. You can find the t-shirt on our Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. It's got a big picture of Joseph Campbell's face on the back of it, so it should be a very desirable item. And then, of course, once you do leave your review, DM us on Twitter or email us at unlimitedopinionspodcast@gmail.com, letting us know where your review is at. So far, no entries, so your odds for winning are very high. You have a great chance at getting that t-shirt for completely free.
It's amazing that we don't have an avalanche of reviews.
I know. I was expecting millions within the first week.
Well, maybe I should. I could put it on my Facebook page. We seem to get more listeners and stuff when I put something on my Facebook page. I only have like 100 and something friends, but we do get some interest. There's an elected official that listens on a regular basis.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I won't identify who that person is.
I get
fear of embarrassment.
Yeah. When I check downloads, I do get like location, general location. Of course, I'm not getting anybody's like home address who downloads the podcast, but I do see a couple of places around, our hometown. And I'm like, who is that listening to this podcast? I'm like, who is this person that either you or I know that is listening to us talk? The issue with putting it on, or we don't know, maybe, maybe it's just, somebody in the community. But the issue with putting it on your Facebook is then it'll be somebody we know. And that makes it strange. But
why?
I don't know.
We know would listen to this.
It's a little strange when you have like, I think it is a little weird to have like people that you knew before. Like, I don't know. It's just a weird crossing of worlds, I guess. It's like I don't expect anybody that I would know that would listen to me talk about these things for hours. But then people do on occasion. It's like, oh, that's weird. I was not making this, or I was not saying these things for anybody that I know. I was saying it to the unknown public at large, if that makes sense.
Well, I got news for you. They're listening to me.
I do hear that from one of our listeners, that she listens, not for me at all, for you, for your asides. Yes.
Well,
the much more enjoyable half of the podcast.
Well, I usually have a couple good rants.
Yes, usually, if not always. But we should get into the topic at hand today, with republicanism, starting off with constitutions and constitutionalism. And Alan Ryan kind of starts by saying that this chapter is concerned with the constitutionalist concern for stable, law-abiding, non-tyrannical government and the civic liberty that is the achievement of Republican governments. That's kind of the main goal of all the thinkers that we're looking at here. How do we get a stable... Yes.
Did we introduce the book that we're talking about?
We did. I made sure. Yes.
I know you mentioned Rand, but I didn't know if you mentioned the title of it. That we're continuing to talk about his book called On Politics.
Okay. Yes, of course, On Politics.
I kind of dozed off when you started talking. I don't know.
Yes, I think that happens pretty regularly. But he kind of says
over an hour. I'm out.
I know. I've been here. But he says that that's kind of the purpose of a lot of these thinkers, that stable, law-abiding, non-tyrannical government and the civic liberty that comes along with it. But he does say that defenses of constitutional rule can be seen as far back as Aristotle, Polybius, and Cicero with their mixed constitutions, and how to create a system that will keep a balance between groups. So that sort of mixed idea and the idea of balance is a big thing that the speaker's going forward in this section as well. And so who are those speakers? We're going to be looking at Harrington, Sidney, and Montesquieu in this chapter. And he starts out by saying that the 17th and 18th century republicanism was a reaction to absolute monarchy and the rise of the nation state. He says that the medieval forms of kingship were replaced by constitutional regimes in England and Holland and absolute monarchies working through bureaucratic administrators in much of Europe. So we are seeing, with the modern idea of the nation state, how are these nations functioning? And it was by and large by absolute monarchs at this time. So, of course, the three thinkers we're looking at are James Harrington and his Oceana, a work on balance and counterpoise, Montesquieu's Spirit of the Law, on what regimes would thrive in what settings, and the obsolescence of classical democratic republics, and Algernon's Sidney's Discourses on the virtues of mixed constitutions and the badness of absolute monarchy. So that's what we will be looking at in this chapter.
So what do you want to give us any foreshadowing of what your general thoughts are on republicanism and these three particular authors?
Well, I like republicanism. Might not come as a surprise to many people with what we've discussed on the podcast before. These thinkers were interesting in that they do outline sort of the basis of what republicanism comes to be, but it's not really in a form that we, I think, recognize as republicanism. It gets a lot of the spirit of it there, but it's not outlined in the way that we would think of it necessarily, with sort of, the layers of government, essentially, with the local, the state, and the federal. They have elements of that, but it's not outlined as we would think of it today, I think. What are your thoughts?
All I could think about when I thought of the name Montesquieu was Cyrano de Bergerac. Do you know Cyrano de Bergerac?
I don't.
You look like you're confused. You've never read or saw the movie Cyrano de Bergerac?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Really? It's a famous kind of love story. The original Cyrano, it was remade by Steve Martin as the movie Roxanne, modern times. And it's a story of a guy in France, Revolutionary time, I think, and he is like a Three Musketeer type, expert swordsman, but he has a giant nose, and so there he could not get the fair Roxanne to, or he didn't think he could get her to love him, and she seems to be smitten by a very dim-witted, and he's very erudite. He is like a poet. He speaks in poetry. He's just a brilliantly insulting and sarcastic character. You might notice why I like that character.
Yeah, the big nose, of course.
Well, that too. I didn't even think of that. Thank you. And anyway, so she becomes smitten by a dim-witted, very attractive young man. And so I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that Cyrano kind of has this plan that he didn't really think out, but that he would supply this young man with words, like he would kind of whisper in various settings so that this guy could woo Roxanne, make her happy, and things go awry. But there's also swords play, and he kills some people and stuff like that. It's a great, not the Steve Martin version.
I was about to say that'd be a little weird to see, Steve Martin killing people with like a rapier. I'm assuming
it would have been better. It would have been much better. It was pretty entertaining, and he was a fireman, so that ruined it for me. But that's a whole different rant.
Yes. Your hatred of firemen, of course.
I do not have a hatred of firemen.
You have a prejudice against firemen.
I do not have a prejudice against firemen.
I think you've used that exact word to describe your feelings against firemen in the past.
That's an overstating. I believe that they are praised beyond measure. And that's a different than saying I have a hatred or a prejudice for them. But every time I do see them responding to a call where there's no fire, I do say out loud, that's another call, because that's how they keep their stats, and that's how they end up raising our taxes. We had 5 million calls this year. Really? How many fires have we had in this town? None. But that's a whole different subject.
We've lost our firefighter audience, unfortunately. I'm very sorry to all those firefighters that have just left.
Very, very politically powerful group. Do you know why?
Because of I think we've talked about this before on the podcast about like the weird power over taxation, right? And that they can raise their own taxes.
That's more of a practical thing. In Missouri, they have a 3-member board, and all they have to do is capture 2 out of the 3 elected members through campaign donations and networking, all that kind of stuff. So practically, it's a great system for them, which is unique to fire districts generally, although there's some road improvement districts, but they don't have that kind of budget. But really, it's because they don't do anything, and so they have plenty of time on their hands to campaign for people. I'm just joking, of course. They're very, very busy. Although a lot of districts are switching to firefighter paramedics. Paramedics work their tails off.
Yes.
And firefighters are necessary, and they're good people, and they're our heroes.
You say begrudgingly.
Well, after 9/11, every fire district in the country was saying, "Remember 9/11? Raise our taxes. We're heroes." Come on, they were heroes. You were sitting on your butt, your fat butt, at the firehouse, to shoot the breeze with your
we need
buddies.
to get you off of the firefighter topic. You said that you weren't going to get into this, and it's been like 5 minutes of talking about firefighters.
That is correct. All you have to do is mention I don't know. No, why did I bring them up? Oh, because Steve Martin was a firefighter. He was a captain of the fire department.
Let's get back to the book, starting off with James Harrington to get into his life and his theories.
We are absolutely going to watch Cyrano de Bergerac, the movie, when you're home over Christmas break. It's a great movie. Okay. It's black and white. It's fantastic. You'll love it.
All right. We will absolutely do that.
All right. So back to the great Harrington.
Yes. Little is known about James Harrington's life. We do know that he was born in 1611, but took no part in politics until 1647 when he joined the household of Charles I and remained there until the king's execution. He then spent several years thinking on the collapse of the monarchy and how to establish a stable replacement. And so he published Oceana in 1656 and dedicated it to Oliver Cromwell. But Cromwell didn't want the first principles of Republican government becoming a matter of public debate, but he interestingly didn't harass Harrington over this. Of course, there's a lot of censorship at this time. But the book did get a lot of critical attention, so it had a lot of eyes on it, but most of them were criticizing the work. And so after the Restoration, Harrington was imprisoned on suspicion of plotting against Charles II, and although he was soon released, he died soon afterwards in 1677 due to the stress of that experience, presumably. So then we get into the structure of Oceana itself. What is this book talking about? And the book is set up with preliminaries sort of on the nature of government, followed by the structure of Oceana, sort of a fictional city that he's sort of examining here. And the preliminaries divide into two parts. Ancient prudence, or the classical statecraft of Greek and Roman republics, and modern prudence, which is the principles of the feudal monarchies after the fall of Rome. And the model of Oceana sets out the fundamental laws of the perfect commonwealth in the deliberation of a fictional constitutional convention. So, of course, using sort of the ideas that we saw before with the humanists and sort of the utopia-esque worlds here. But Harrington defended ancient prudence in Machiavelli's view of liberty, and he said that the difference between absolute rule and the rule of a free republic is infinite. So he's very much opposed to absolute rule, very much trying to find, what is the free republic? How do we secure this here? I'm going to read from the book here. There's an interesting way of putting it. He says, government, to define it de jure or according to ancient prudence, is an art whereby a civil society of men is instituted and preserved upon the foundation of common right or interest. Or, to follow Aristotle and Livy, it is the empire of laws and not of men. In contrast, government, to define it de facto, or according unto modern prudence, is an art whereby some man or some few men subject a city or nation and rule it according unto his or their private interest, which, because the laws in such cases are made according to the interest of a man or of some few families, may be said to be the empire of men and not of laws. So very much kind of favoring the ancients here, the empire of laws, not men, over the sort of modern state of things, the empire of men and not laws, sort of drawing the distinction there. How do we get back to that more ancient idea? You look like you have thoughts on that.
I do, because the United States was always thought of as a nation of laws and not men. I mean, it's like almost a motto. And I don't know if that's that. I mean, I know it's still the case, but boy, it's got to be like 50-50. You're getting close to it with this cabal of self-serving.
Oh yeah, I have some quotes outlined by Montesquieu, particularly later on in the chapter, that just outline exactly what I think we've been talking about a lot with what's going on in the United States right now. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But Harrington, I think, is spot on.
Right.
It's not a good system when it's just an empire of men, not laws. What is the basis behind their decrees? He's saying there's not much, really, just the fact that they are in charge and they set the laws, and that's sort of the end all be all, essentially.
Right. It's just, if you have the power, you assert it.
Exactly.
Right.
And Harrington was also obsessed with balance, but not to rescue the monarchy in the way that Charles I described balance. He was all about, we need the balance between the parliament and the kingship, but he wanted to keep the monarchy in place. But Harrington instead drew heavily on Machiavelli, and he said that he had, but he did say that Machiavelli had missed the idea of balance dangerously, because Machiavelli, of course, thought of balance as sort of a constant tension between the groups, and that's how you maintain stability, is trying, pitting the groups against each other. But Harrington says that to have the nobility and the commons cooperate for the good of all, and that's how you achieve the appropriate balance and keep things, moving in a good direction. He also said that balance was based on the ownership of land, and this is sort of his very central theory throughout all of this. He said that the landowner has something to defend and the resources to arm himself, and serving as a soldier to defend his country made him a virtuous citizen. And so that's sort of the nature of where we derive a lot of our freedoms. He'll talk about a little bit more here. He was focused on the Gothic balance. He believed that modern kingship grew out of the arrangements between barbarian tribes after the fall of Rome, which stabilized as feudalism. And the balance was the proportion of land held by the estates of the land. And he said that there was a 4-estate balance in England: the king, the lords spiritual, the lords temporal, and the commons. And so that's how land was divided amongst these 4 different groups. And so he was interested in landowners who could bear their own arms in a militia, and he was very concerned about the threat of a permanent standing army. He was very much aware that, if a king had a bunch of well-armed people under his direct control, he could control everything. And Alan Ryan does, make the point that this was echoed 94 years later in the Second Amendment of the United States. And so the king governed with the concurrence of barons because he relied on them to provide the militias to defend his realm. And so long as the nobles had no reason to unite and rise against him, there would be peace. So he's kind of saying, it was in the king's best interests to make sure that he had the nobles like him, essentially. And then the nobles, of course, relied on the militias to keep them in power. And so if the king wanted to remain in power, he needed to make sure he was keeping everybody happy. Otherwise, these militias would essentially be united by the nobles and rise up against the king directly. And that's sort of how he claimed that we should keep balance in a way.
Correct. And I was interested in his thoughts, and I think one of the other authors has a lot of thoughts about and it seemed like a theme, the danger of a standing army, because the army could then turn on its citizens and thwart the law. And we don't really have that concern in modern America, but I think there is a concern with I mean, it's pretty darn close to paramilitary operations with our FBI, ATF, DEA, and when you talk about the intelligence communities, is CIA and the NSA to a certain extent as well, that they are a threat to our liberty because they're completely and totally unaccountable in ways that they're talking about in England in the 1600s. They would have never the functions of these federal agencies and these federal law enforcement agencies are very similar to what their concerns are about the standing army, as far as quartering people and coming, search and seizure issues and just enforcing the will of the central government, which is the king. And now we have those issues with regard to the FBI in particular is just horrible at this point.
Well, I mean, I also think of like the IRS. I know that was a big news story a while back. They hired 86,000 new agents or whatever. And it's like, what are you doing with that amount of people? It's always the question of,
Yeah, they authorized 87,000 new agents. They haven't hired them yet, or maybe they have, but they also have their own law enforcement agency. They have their own, I mean, they bought up so much ammo and they have so many weapons. It's almost inconceivable. I mean, they're essentially a small army unto themselves. Each one of these federal agencies have enough to conquer a small nation. Yeah. If they weren't so incompetent, they probably would. They'd end up shooting themselves.
Yes. He then goes on to say, Harrington goes on to say that the aristocratic balance collapsed in England because of the measures of Henry VII, which increased the number of small independent farmers. And then political arrangements were aristocratic, but land ownership then favored the commons. So he says, you're having this difference between, all of your politics are based on the aristocracy, but the aristocracy has lost a lot of its power because a bunch more land is now held by the common people. And that's why we lost stability in England. And that was due to Henry VII's measures, which is an interesting idea, which I think, probably is correct. If you have all the power in a select few people, but then those few people lose what, gave them that power in the first place, why do they have that power anymore? You're definitely going to achieve, instability very soon.
Right. Because at some point people are going to realize, there's no reason for me to listen to you.
Exactly. He then goes on to describe Oceania. He says, Oceania achieves stability through a representative system by economic law, or by the economic basis of the community. And he set up a system similar to the Italian city-state. There is a small Senate that deliberates and a larger popular assembly that has the power of decision. So you'd have a smaller group of people that was actually, putting forward the things to be voted on, but then the larger crowd of people actually voted on those things. He said it was balanced because most of the land was owned by ordinary persons. And this ensures a free republic, civic virtue, and a valiant people for those reasons that we described before. They have something to defend. They have the means to defend themselves. And, they see it as an honor to serve their country. And he also combined both the republic for an expansion and for preservation. He said that was kind of an idea behind, earlier forms of republicanism or constitutionalism was either the idea that we need to keep expanding or that we need to preserve ourselves. But he says, we can combine those two. He says Oceania would be imperial, but the egalitarian repartition of property would avoid the mistakes of Rome of settling soldiers on conquered territory. He says that's kind of the reason that Rome fell, is because you placed, your foreign people into this land and gave them control over all the land. But he sees Oceania as it expands, making sure that the people that you conquer and you bring in have access to their own land as well, to keep that sort of equal footing of the common people. He also somewhat blurs the distinction of philosopher and political theorist. Says Oceania possesses a civil religion requiring only the most non-contentious and politically helpful beliefs. He says order in Oceania will be, achieved by reason and be conformed to nature, for nature is rational, and he hopes to escape Polybius's cycle of decay for those reasons. It's a society governed by reason. It's very equal. We won't achieve this cycle of decay that Polybius set out, many thousands of years ago, and he sees this as sort of the ideal society here. What do you think of Oceania?
Well, it's interesting thought experiment. I was just going to comment on the civic religion being the most non-controversial parts of the common religions, I suppose. And it reminded me of an article I just read last week about a Catholic church in India. And there was a particular bishop, and they were trying to update their liturgy. And I didn't even really understand what the issue is, but part of it had to be whether the priest would face the congregation during the Eucharist blessing and all that stuff, or what the liturgy of the Eucharist, I guess it would be, or whether he would face the
altar.
Let's say whether he'd be behind the altar, in front of the altar, I guess, but face the sacristy. No.
No, are you thinking of where the Eucharist is stored?
Yes. What is that word?
Not the monstrance. That's the big fancy one for adoration. I can't think of the word right now either. I should know it.
Yes, I should too. But anyway, so it's like, it seems to me to be somewhat trivial procedural thing. But there were protesters that locked the bishop out of the church. He was coming over to conduct services, and they kept him from getting there. The police couldn't get him in. So for his own safety, he had to flee the area. And I just thought it was kind of amusing that anybody would think that there are such things as a universal, a non-controversial religious views, that you can have a state.
No, that facing the audience thing is a big thing, or was a big thing in the Catholic Church. I have a friend up here who's like super Catholic, like uber Catholic, and he's still like upset about a lot of the reforms, after the change from the Latin Mass. Right. And that in particular is one of them, because it's kind of the idea in his sort of way of thinking. It's like, are we, with the priest in worshiping Jesus, or are we worshiping the priest and Jesus because we're all facing him and he's no longer facing Jesus in the same direction that we are? It's kind of taking, the priest as a more active role there. So it's a big issue.
It was a big issue in Vatican II. I mean, but we're talking like what is it, 60s?
Yeah, 60s, early 70s.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm just kind of making it as an aside. I just kind of like to be able to see what's going on.
So
if he's in the way, hey, down in front, come on, turn around, let me see what that stuff is. What are you doing over there?
But what do you think of
kind of like I like Subway, because as far as fast food restaurants go, because I'm right there while they fix it. Every other place, I'm wondering, what do they do with my food?
Microwaving it usually. That's what we did at Fazoli's for some of the stuff. It's a company secret, I guess. The microwave is heavily used at Fazoli's restaurants.
I don't think there's any secrets about Fazoli's cooking.
Yeah. I don't think people had too high expectations. But what do you think of Oceania?
I like their spaghetti and meatballs. I eat that every once in a
There
while.
you go. Let me ask you for the third time. What do you think of Oceana?
And again, I don't think I've had any other dish than spaghetti and meatballs at Fazoli because I liked it the first time, and I'm afraid to get something different because I might not like that. I know I'm gonna
Oh.
like the spaghetti and meatballs anyway. I thought I answered that. But I mean, he has some general thoughts.
Mhm,
I don't really know how instructive it is, what we should do, but
mhm,
I think he's onto something with the balance of the property owners.
mhm,
If people are not invested in the country, however that is, you're going to have trouble.
mhm,
And if they don't have ownership, it's just like in a business. If your people don't have ownership over the business or their job, a sense um, uh, of pride about what they're doing and what they're doing it for, you got problems.
yeah,
And so I think he's onto something with that theory that you need to have a certain amount of ownership of the citizenry to
mhm,
end up having a functioning republic.
mhm.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think it's an interesting setup for society, and it definitely has those sort of Republican, undertones to it, with the idea of sort of the two different levels of government, in a certain fashion. But I think really the Republican, air quotes, Republican part of it is that sort of the ability of the people to defend their land and themselves, and that sort of idea against a tyrannical government should it ever come to that. I think that's the most important thing coming out of Harrington here. And Alan Ryan does kind of mention that and how it was preserved in the United States Constitution, but sort of recognizing that need for the common person to be able to defend himself, not just from whatever dangers there are in this time period, just out on the road and robbers and things like that, but also against the government itself, should it come to that.
Yeah, and the people would have the ability and that really the need for the government to have those citizens participate. You know,
Mm-hmm,
there's a certain amount of aggregate power for those people because if everybody has a little bit of a property ownership, or many people do, then you're not going to be able to get much done if you don't have at least a lot of their agreement on the
mm-hmm,
big stuff
yeah,
too. So that balance
true.
of ownership is important too.
Mm-hmm. Alan Ryan then moves in to talk about the unkindness of history. He says that Harrington's argument was based on the idea that the central economic task of government is to pay for its defense, and the way for government does so determines its fate. But he says that the independent freeholder keeping and bearing his own arms and ready to serve in a militia was the modernized view was a modernized view of the ideal citizen of Rome and Sparta, sort of that militaristic society, being able to fight for your country or for yourself. However, Alan Ryan says that history soon proved that the professional standing armies did not threaten the nation state and were not too hard to pay for, with efficient central banks and the ability to float public loans at low rates of interests. So once we got these, economic systems developed, we realized, or these countries realized, hey, we can just have a permanent standing army. It won't be too much of a burden on us. But Harrington thought that post-feudal, non-absolute monarchy was impossible. He said that there's only one freedom-preserving constitutional regime, and that was the popular republic, a republic based on the people. However, he says, Alan Ryan says, under the Hanoverians, perhaps, the Hanovers, England's mixed regimes flourished due to a central bank that could manufacture credit for the king's purposes and a system of patronage that ensured all the king's men could get into parliament. He says that the system was corrupt and immoral but stable, and it showed that the mixed system was not doomed to fail, but could even grow in strength. So not a perfect system by any means, but it's also not doomed to fail, as Harrington saw that it was with this absolute monarchy having so much influence. It is possible to still keep that in place. You didn't necessarily need to rely on militias to do so. I guess you have no thoughts on that. You're looking at me with like a blank expression on your face.
No, I would again state that I think he's right about. I think the author's comment about the standing army is not a danger to the republic,
Mm-hmm.
but I think we're into a phase that the law enforcement militia
Mm-hmm.
that we have in the United States is becoming a danger to our freedom, and I don't think people are really grasping that. And the feds would be offended by that statement,
Mm-hmm.
calling them a militia, but they're lawless. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they're no different than any other group of armed people that are not following the law.
Mm-hmm.
In a general sense. Of course, they'd be insulted by that, and it's intended. So I think his point that that is a danger. It was passe for a couple hundred years, several hundred years, but now his complaints about the risk of a standing army, I think, is just a different way. They're really paramilitary operations, just like you'd have in Chile under Pinochet. You know, you got them in I think El Salvador. You had some, you know, where you have these, you know, these. Well, you have them in the in Iran. You know, these kind of non-uniformed, irregular forces that are trying to shut down the protesters. And I'm not saying the FBI is the same as those. The FBI have badges.
That's great.
Just joking, of course, to our FBI listener.
Yes.
But you know that if there's somebody in the FBI listening to us, that FBI agent is like, right on, Bishop. You know it's true. Anyway, go ahead.
We then move into Algernon Sidney and his ideas. And Sidney first reasserted Harrington's Republican principles in the Discourses Concerning Government. That's the main work we're going to look at here. And this defended free government, but with more faith in the aristocracy. And Sidney was born in 1622 to the Earl of Leicester. He helped put down the Irish Rebellion in 1641 to 43 and became a member of Parliament in 1646, but refused to act as a commissioner to try Charles I. And so from 1659 to 1677, he was in a self-imposed exile and returned to England to fight against the absolutist pretensions of Charles II. And he had very militant anti-tyrannical politics. I like this quote here. One of his quotes from one of his books, Manus haec inimice tyrannis ensi petit placidam cum libertate quietam, which of course translates to English as this hand, enemy to tyrants with the sword, seeks a tranquil peace with liberty. So very much, actively and very militarily pursuing peace.
Yes. Good way to put it.
Yeah. Using the sword to find peace. But he was arrested and convicted.
The only way it's found, Adam. It's the only way you have it.
I figured you'd agree with that. He was later arrested and convicted on the word of a corrupt witness and was executed in 1683 at the time of the Rye House plot, but was acquitted in 1689 posthumously. Later acknowledgement that, probably shouldn't have killed that guy.
That's not probably. I mean, he was exonerated. That means they did.
Yes.
I mean, it's fascinating that they did it so quickly. And it's just, when I was reading this the other day, your mother was in the room, and I was mentioning just how, as a reminder to myself, just how dangerous it was for these thinkers and these philosophers, these authors. Now, when we say something stupid or maybe something smart and dangerous, we're worried about somebody making a negative comment on social media, or if it gets really bad, they'll delete our Twitter account or something. These guys were tortured and murdered because they made too much sense. I mean, it's just crazy how dangerous it has always been throughout history for political thinkers and political writers, and we should have more courage. Is my lesson to myself, I guess. Not to you. I don't want you getting killed.
I appreciate the sentiment.
Keep your mouth shut.
I'll try. But he goes on to say that the discourses, like Locke's first treatises, were written against Robert Filmer's Patriarcha. And so Sidney asserted that the authority is not paternal, but rests on consent, and that kings only possess authority so long as they observe the laws of a popular assembly or a parliament. So that's very much one of his core beliefs here. It's not just because it was passed down from Adam, as Robert Filmer said, but authority has to rest on consent and follow the law. He also thought that the measure of a good government was a society's ability to wield the sword as effectively as the Romans and Saxons. So again, kind of taking from Harrington that sort of militaristic approach. But he also thought that the aristocracy had been weakened and a popular government was the only alternative to despotism, but with a reinvigorated aristocracy. So not just do away with the aristocracy entirely, but we need to bring it back in a better fashion along with a sort of popular feature here. And he says that government exists either by force, making it a tyranny, or by consent, which makes it a legitimate authority. He says that the rights of all magistrates are conferred on them by the people, and what the people give, they can take away. And he says that people may set up whatever government it chooses without dissolving itself as a people. So similar to Locke's ideas as well. He says that there is the right to rebel is confined to the right to reinstate a lawful government. You can't just go around rebelling and not doing anything with it. He says a tyrannical government is the supreme evil that we have to guard against. That is the main thing threatening us is tyranny. That is what we always must keep in mind. But he also never put forth the idea of the best government, but he does say that the tyrant is definitely the worst. We can't really say what's the best. It differs by the people, but tyranny is always the worst. However, he did favor an aristocratic republic. He says that the aristocracy is a great source of political energy. The way he kind of envisioned this was a meritocracy whose leadership is freely accepted. So the people do recognize that there are some people with more merit to lead, and so they are sort of freely followed. It's not a forced aristocracy by any means. He says all good governments mix the rule of many, the few, and the one, kind of going back to that idea of the mixed constitution, which part is more effective for doing what. He also had no difficulty in invoking God, as Alan Ryan mentions. He says God alone possesses absolute authority, not any human. And he says reason reveals the dictates of natural law, and the obligations of natural law are strengthened by the institutions of government. So the government should go along with natural law. A good government should never make us go against natural law as determined by reason.
I wanted to point out to our viewer that I am nodding along to all of this. I agree with everything this guy is saying, and you passed over the notable phrase, I think, that Jefferson borrowed, that where this author denied that God had caused some to be born with crowns upon their heads and all others with saddles upon their backs. And boy, that is a strong statement against any sort of divine aristocracy, any sort of divine right of kings or anybody else, and that we're all born. God created us free and equal. And so he agreed with that Lockean principle that we were born free and equal, and if we're not free, then somebody on earth has taken that freedom from us because we were born free and we're entitled to it. And some of us weren't born with crowns and others with saddles. We're all born free and equal, and then we should be moving along based upon what we do in life, and not just saddled with that, so to speak.
Absolutely. He goes on to say that good government doesn't preserve all natural liberty, but we should give up as little liberty as possible. The best governments interfere least with their subjects. So this idea that, we do have to give up some of our liberties to enter into a government, to enter into a society. But in best case scenario, it'll be very, very minimal. He also says he pits the corruption, as sort of the evil side here against the good side of citizen loyalty, courage, and military fortitude. And so this places Sidney in both a liberal and Republican tradition. So, having that very, freedom-focused, liberty-focused, but also along with sort of the virtues of the good citizen in this republic, in the society that we're setting up here, kind of combining those two, putting in squarely in the Republican tradition. So yeah, I agree very heavily with just about everything that Algernon Sidney is saying here. This freedom, that we're all created equal. And that if government exists by force, it's a tyranny. There's no other way to it. It's either consent or force, and if it's by force, it's not a government at all. It's illegitimate entirely.
Yeah, and he's right to identify corruption as something that will undermine a republic, because you have to have dedicated citizens, not just subjects, not just bums. We all should assert our responsibility in a republic, or else it won't work either, because eventually the corruption will just eat it from within. But yeah, great stuff. I mean, great author, and you can see why he's so influential, in the future generations. Although I didn't really familiar with him.
Yeah, that's another thing. I had never really heard of Sidney or really Harrington too much. I'm sure I've heard the name before, but I've never looked into him. I've heard the name Montesquieu a few times, but I've never really looked into any of this political philosophy here. But of course, very much stuff that we both agree with, of course, in the Republican tradition here. But then we do move into Montesquieu.
This is a small R Republican.
Yes.
This is not like Republican Party stuff. This should be universal between all Americans should really support these general thoughts about divided government and free and equal people that are born free, all that stuff.
Absolutely. But then to move into Montesquieu, whose real name is Charles Louis de Secondant, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu, so very French. He was born in 1689 and served in a judge position inherited from his uncle in the Parlement court. He also had the education to serve efficiently as he went to a rigorous college in Paris and studied law at the Sorbonne for 3 years. But he cared most for his literary and intellectual life. He became a member of the Académie Française in 1728 and was a visible figure in Parisian literary life, and his best-known work was The Spirit of the Laws, written in 1748, which was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books in 1751, which Alan Ryan notes was a mark of sort of approval among the thinkers in Paris at this time. And he, of course, died in Paris in 1755. He says The Spirit of the Laws was recognized as a masterpiece, being a foundational work of modern political sociology. He says the impact was assisted by good fortune. It found readers in Scotland and the Americas, inspiring other major political authors to examine the customs and workings of their own political systems. And there are 3 large subjects within The Spirit of the Laws, that being the differences between forms of government, the obsolescence of the classical city-state, and the idea of how to achieve modern political freedom. So those are the 3 topics we'll be going into with Montesquieu's work here.
Yeah, and you skipped over one of the mentioning about his writings is that right before that last subject, the history, culture, economics, and foreign entanglements interact in a fashion so peculiar to each country that modest improvements to our own institutions is usually wiser than borrowing from other nations. And boy, we learned that the hard way with Iraq and Afghanistan and all of our foreign endeavors over the last 50 years, that it doesn't make sense just to kind of superimpose, like as George Bush said, everybody yearns to be free. But if you don't have a culture of a citizen run republic, you're not going to be successful in imposing that, because you will soon have people that will just murder or whatever to gain power immediately. And, it's like you have one election and that's it, because nobody respects elections. I mean, what was the point? So, here's a guy talking, what was he in the 1600s still?
Yep.
And
1700s.
1700s, and he's dead on, and it's like people forgot these very basic rules of life and society. And anyway, that's my little break.
He's very interesting. He was definitely the thinker that I liked most in this chapter. I really dug what he was getting into here. And he first distinguishes between the laws of nations that governs the dealings of states with each other, and political law, which governs the dealings of state with its subjects, and civil law, which governs the dealings of citizens with each other. So these 3 levels of law, citizens with each other, then citizens and the state, and then states with states. He also divides governments into republican, monarchical, and despotic. And he says the nature of government is different than the spirit. So he says the spirit of a republican government is virtue, a spirit of monarchy is honor, and the spirit of despotism is fear. So this is different than what we had in the past with, the democracies or the aristocracies and the monarchies as sort of the 3 distinctions. He says, you can have a republican, monarchy, a monarchy that has the spirit of virtue, essentially. And he gets into that a little bit later. But he says he did not object to distinctions of rule by the one, the many, and the few, but he thought that they did not address the animating principles of governments. That's what he's looking at with these 3, spirits. What is driving these governments to continue in the future? What is the purpose, essentially? What is animating them? And he says
it's interesting. I'm gonna have a little aside. We had the fortune of listening to Josh Hammer speak in the last week, and he talks a lot about the spirit, or really what he called the telos, of the United States Constitution. And I think it's a similar thing here, that there is a certain spirit or certain common theme of any successful government. And it's interesting. He's talking about virtue, honor, and fear, and these different types of government. So I think that's, when you look at a lot of different aspects of Republican government, I think it's important to look at that, and it's something I hadn't really thought about much before.
Yes, good points. Good points.
Thanks.
I'm going to read from the book here. He says the most natural
What
form
page?
On page 523. He says the most natural form of republic is democratic, or at any rate popular. The thought is this: in a republic, the people is sovereign. In a sufficiently small and simple republic, the people govern themselves directly without representatives. In any case, a republic is defined by the sovereignty of the people. The rule is the reverse of Justinian's what pleases the emperor has the force of law, being rather what pleases the people has the force of law. This is the view that Rousseau and Kant spelled out. Any state that is constitutionally governed and aims consistently at the public good is properly called a republic, even if its executive power lies in the hands of a monarch. It's this idea, it is always for the benefit of the people. That's kind of how he's looking at virtue here. How is it, how is power held in consent in the hands of the people here? And that's how you look at a republic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He also says that the democratic virtues of the ancient city-states can be reconciled with the administrative and military effectiveness of in confederation of popular republics that can unite when needed. And says that's how we align, the virtues of the past with the effectiveness of today. He says the dangers of popular republics are that they are very vulnerable to infighting and self-destruction, and these dangers grow as they get larger. And so an association of these republics can defend the whole more easily and suppress factional disorder. So, if you just have, one unit that is, constantly fighting within itself, you're never going to get anywhere. But if you can associate these with each other and kind of build them into a whole when needed, that is the best way to secure sort of security in a way, I guess, the defense of the whole and make sure there's no infighting.
It's really the philosophical basis for federalism. You have a unit of a lesser government that has more authority over the day-to-day operations and a little bit more independence from each other, but you have to have some sort of unification of ideals or of interests, just like our states. People don't. I wonder how many Americans know that each state is a separate sovereign.
Yeah.
United States, probably less than 10%, maybe. But because we've melded them so much, but it's also beneficial on the local level. Like, the state of Missouri is divided in, I don't know how many counties, too many counties, but there are a lot of counties, and then counties have different political subdivisions within each of them. And so you kind of have this, so you can have, the state of Missouri having, well, I use a controversial topic like abortion. We can have regulations with regard to abortion that are significantly different than the state of New York or California. And some, and that one may be a good example, but on some level with a lot of these other things, like, taxation, we can have different taxes and different spending within these states. Let's use that as a better example. And, we can say, well, we don't care what California does as far as how much they tax their people and how much they spend on whatever. And they don't care about what we do. But, if there's a war, then we're all in it together because we're all Americans. And that's, I think, what he's talking about here. And I think Jefferson picked up on that as far as having separate, lesser governmental entities that joined together in a confederation, which originally the states were a confederation and then became a country of states.
Absolutely. And then he says that he sharply distinguishes between the moderate governments that depended on and were governed by the law, and despotisms which were dependent on the arbitrary will of the ruler. He also distinguished between how the ancient and modern citizens relate to their polity, and so that's a big theme going forward. How are things different in the modern day? He says that there are now more sources of private pleasure that makes us less devoted to our fatherland. We don't have to engage with the community so often because there's just other things to do, is essentially what he's saying. And I think that's become even more true today than it was back in 1748. He says that the ancients also insisted on ideological uniformity. He says this idea is now stifling to be inculcated into absolute devotion to the state. That's kind of the goal of a lot of these ancient city-states, was making sure that everybody was 100% devoted to the state. Sort of that ideological uniformity says, we don't have that anymore. That's just not a possible thing for us to do anymore.
Right.
He also says that
there's possible, but it's not. You're not going to have a free republic. You're going to have, China or North Korea or something really horrible.
Yeah, no kidding. He also drew no sharp line between democracy and aristocracy. Says the idea that government by consent must entail democracy is a modern notion. You don't have to have every single citizen voting to have a system based on consent. He also said that the citizens of popular republics have a passion for equality, and for the ancients, this is equal political standing, but now it has become economic equality. That's the equality that we think of today, and I think is still true back then for Montesquieu as well. He says that the classically virtuous citizen had disappeared as a possibility, but Rome had left behind the need to treat people with rights under the law. So that's what he kind of says that the legacy of Rome is here. We cannot achieve Rome. essentially, but we can
Right.
achieve Rome's rule by law. That is what we should be doing. We cannot recreate Rome, but we can recreate some of the values held by Rome, and that is the important thing to do. Because, like you said earlier, it's not one size fits all. We can't just apply this ancient system to our modern system today. Entirely different time and place. We have to keep that in mind. Draw the lessons from Rome, but not draw Rome entirely to England,
Right.
or to France,
And,
or to
and
wherever.
yeah, and I thought it was fascinating how he includes that everyone can be guaranteed freedom from ill treatment, but
Mm-hmm.
not everyone can be given a real say in how he or she is governed.
Mm-hmm.
And in a republic as big as ours, you kind of don't have
Mm-hmm.
a whole lot of say in how the laws are governed, but you do have a guarantee that you're supposed to have a guarantee that you're going to be free from ill treatment. You have certain
Mm-hmm.
like constitutional rights that they can't take away from you. And I think it's a good point early on,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
in his writings
absolutely.
this long ago.
He then sets out the sort of the difference between the Ottoman Empire and the French monarchy, and he says that the differences of spirit between the monarchy and despotism separated these two systems. He says, function-wise, they were kind of the same. They were both absolute rule by one person, but the French king exercised his authority in a society based on honor, rank, and station. So he says that he was essentially required, if someone was required to do something dishonorable in the French country, this person would likely revolt, and therefore the king's authority was theoretically unlimited but practically limited. The king is always keeping in mind when making these decisions, hey, if I go too far, the people are going to rise up against me. He says, that spirit is not there in the Ottoman Empire. The people just
Right.
do as they're told. That is the difference between these two systems. He says that kings cannot govern moderately unless they share the values of their people. And I think this is something that I think definitely still applies today. If our elected officials do not share our values, are they really governing moderately? If they have entirely separate values to us, how moderately can they even, govern at all if they're trying to achieve very different things than we are, if they value very different things than what we value. He also says that England was an oddity in that its laws secured liberty, but despite being a monarchy. He says that this lay in the separation of powers. This is how they achieved that. He says, Montesquieu articulated for the first time the separation of powers in the modern way. He distinguished between a power to enforce the laws, the power to decide cases, and the power to legislate. Of course, our modern day legislative, executive, and judicial branches. However, he did think that the judiciary was null, and that a clear law, well-attested evidence, and rational court procedures would produce just obvious answers. Best case scenario, the judiciary factor shouldn't really have to do much at all, which is very much opposed to, I think, our modern system. We've talked about the Supreme Court quite a few times here, with them just, imposing, new rules on things and stuff like that.
Not just new rules, just completely new law.
Yeah.
And it's gotten out of control. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
well, any reasonable person is seeing that now.
Yeah, absolutely. So this next section, I think I can't even summarize better than it is in the book. So I'm going to read a few sections from the book here that I think are just spot on descriptions of what's going on today. He says, first, talking about the English again, the English have both the separation of powers and their judicious entanglement. The different powers are accessible to different social groups, so each group can check its rivals, while their entanglement means the executive can influence the conduct of parliament and vice versa. It is thus this that secures the balance, says Montesquieu. So, all of these powers are available to people of very different opinions, so they can always check each other. Then moving on to page 529, it says Montesquieu's idea of the separation of power was not primarily institutional. A society where individuals are uniformly subject to the tyranny of opinion, an idea that Montesquieu was the first to hit upon, could preserve an institutional separation of powers while losing its liberty if the same convictions permeated all institutions. Moving on to page 530, he says here, says a society that met the fate that Tocqueville feared would not have the liberty that Montesquieu thought England had. Individuals would act not from conviction, but because they were brainwashed or frightened. One could even imagine a society full of intermediary groups succumbing to such a fate. There would be administrative hierarchies, a highly differentiated working population, local loyalty, and varied religious attachments. But if there was ideological uniformity and a disposition to subject dissenters to whatever psychological pressure was needed to bring them into line, it would not possess the liberty he praised. What Montesquieu praised was what the United States has always prided itself on: multiple points of access to political institutions for different social groups, and the readiness of those who operate the various institutions to stand up for themselves. I don't know if that's still the case today. This book was written 10 years ago now in 2012. This idea that, if, every institution is available to everybody of every opinion, that is what we should strive for. I don't know if that's so much the case. I don't know if you have a rant you want to go on based on those principles. I'm sure you have one lined up, but
Well, I don't really have a rant. I would just say COVID-19, because there was no access to government or to the public
mm-hmm,
to provide an alternative view of what it is and what should be done about it, and all aspects of it. And it really was brainwashing techniques writ
mm-hmm,
large over the entire country. And I don't really blame the people so much as I blame, the federal bureaucracy who united is
mm-hmm,
bipartisan. So if you're going to blame any person in particular the most, it would be Trump,
yeah,
because he's out there at the forefront with all this nonsense. Turns out all of it's nonsense. And he appointed the Fauci as the spokesperson, who was supported by all the left wingers, and it was a unanimity.
mm-hmm,
And so it was. I don't think that applies, and I think there's a lot. I think the author is right, but I don't think the author of this book is right about what
yeah,
America is now. But
mm-hmm,
you skipped over, I think, the money quote of the book,
mm-hmm,
which is he's paraphrasing Montesquieu, where he says a useful, because Montesquieu is a believer in aristocracy and the benefit
mm-hmm,
of it, and to be leaders and all that kind of stuff. And he says a useful aristocracy is not an object of popular hatred,
mm,
but a useless one is. A
yeah,
useful aristocracy will support the regime it helps to administer, but a useless aristocracy will be disaffected and exercise a subversive rather than a supportive influence.
mm,
And that's the heart of our problem today. And
mm-hmm,
I don't know that I didn't know that it was true in 10 years ago, if it was, but I know it's true now. We have
mm-hmm,
a useless aristocracy.
yeah,
And my favorite thing to do when people start talking politics, which we don't talk very much, but it came up in a group gathering of people about my age a couple weeks ago, and I said, well, which would you rather have, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, or some idiot that you pick randomly out of the phone book?
mm,
And everybody's like, yeah, I'd rather have some idiot out of the phone book, because they wouldn't be completely goofballs and corrupt, and maybe they really care about doing a good job,
yeah,
um, and just keeping their head down and trying to get their work done. But our aristocracy, the people that we're choosing as leaders from among
mm-hmm,
this group, they're all useless, every
yeah,
last one of them.
yeah,
And that's really, I think, a key portion of his thinking about the aristocracy and how a functioning republic can work, and how to
mm-hmm,
maintain that functionality.
yeah. When I was reading those sections, my mind immediately went to like education and like pop culture, not just touching on, the political institutions, but like just the other institutions that influence just about every part of our lives. Of education has gotten to such a state where it's predominantly people on the left. Like I can
Right.
in my entire college campus I can think of two professors that are not like very very left, like maybe three if we're including like center people and the people who are not very very left, of course.
Right.
But everybody is very much of one political opinion on college campuses, and it's the same thing with Hollywood and a lot of these other major institutions, of just like they expect everybody to agree with them if you want to get a job in these fields, if you want to produce something in these fields. And it's become such an issue that's like that is I think a tyranny of opinion, as Montesquieu would look at it. There's no access for people of very different opinions to exist in these sorts of places, I don't think.
Right.
I haven't exactly
And
tested the limits in most of my classes, but I think there's a lot of people on college campuses or in the media in Hollywood or whatever that don't want to say what they really believe because they're afraid they'll be kicked out, they'll be out of a job, they'll lose their scholarships, whatever, because it is so dominated by one point of view and nothing else, which is the opposite of what education should be.
yeah, and I have two thoughts on that. One is that it's even more astounding, since you're going to a taxpayer supported public entity,
Mm-hmm. In the
uh,
middle of rural Missouri.
yeah, a governmental entity, and of course the solution's going to be that we just need to wipe out the personnel
Hmm.
writ large. I mean, I'm talking about massive, massive cutbacks
Yeah.
and all these publicly funded operations. But it also, the other thing is, we're letting them do it. You know, I
Hmm.
mean, at some point, you got to run the risk. And
Yeah.
I don't want to say that to you personally
Hmm.
because I'm your dad, and I don't want you to run any risks, any unnecessary risks. But um, it's hard to complain about it if you aren't willing to put some
Yeah.
skin in the game.
Yeah.
And so I'm getting more and more motivated to get involved again.
Hmm.
Although I've sworn off politics, but
Yeah.
you know, I think we just need people that are just willing to say, you know, to hell with all this,
Yeah.
you know, and I don't care if half the country hates me
Hmm. Yeah.
or half the community hates me, as long as the other half gives me enough authority to fire a bunch of people
Hmm.
that deserve to be fired and cut funding for a bunch of left wing lunacy.
Hmm.
You know, maybe I'm willing to put up with that. I don't know,
Yeah.
but I think hopefully there's a lot of people across the country that are starting to agree with me, and hopefully there's
Yeah.
a lot of people in your generation that are starting to say, you know what, it's not worth it. It's
Yeah.
not. It's the risk. You know, you're going to be defamed either way, so
Yeah.
you might as well just jump into it.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, no, it's definitely like I've been getting this feeling recently that I should be like doing more in a way. I think that's like exactly what you're describing here. You know, it's I think there's just such a lack of, not left-leaning thought. I'm not even like advocating for the, more right-leaning thought, just less of the left-leaning thought in the public universities and of course, any university. But I think it's definitely time that, something is made that, advocates for, other forms of thought on these campuses. Like just other opportunities for people to learn beyond just what the standard left leaning professor is saying, because I don't think there is enough
Right.
of that on college campuses.
You know, and it's not that you have to be a super activist. You just
Hmm.
have to say, you know, no. You know,
Yeah.
you just have to say, I'm not going to participate in that, and no, you're wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
No, and um, you know, I think at some point soon, um, I hope to be in a position where there is someone that makes a land acknowledgement, and I'm given
Mm.
the opportunity to acknowledge that God is the creator of all
Mm.
things, and that is, I'm going to acknowledge God, and I am not going to acknowledge some illiterate nomads that temporarily occupied this land before me by murdering some other illiterate nomads to
Mm.
obtain
Yes.
temporary possession of the property. Because I don't know if anybody in
Hmm.
Kirksville, Missouri, is doing those kind of land acknowledgments, because I don't think, I mean, some tribe might have passed through there, but it's not a really fertile ground for a community such as that
Yeah.
in these times. But
Yes.
perhaps there is one that's up there. I don't know. I'd be
I,
surprised if there isn't at least one that is acknowledging
yeah.
some sort of obscure Missouri
Hmm.
tribe. Because Osage, I don't think, went up that north.
I don't think so. No, we most of my professors have put land acknowledgement statements like in their syllabi. I forget what exactly each of them reads, but it's something, standard and just copied and pasted from one professor to each other. Like
So who are we acknowledging for
I
northern
forget. I'll,
Missouri?
I'll have to I'll have to look it up
Get one
after the
to me.
podcast.
Get one to me. I need to, because you know what? It doesn't cost that much to do direct mail for a town the size of Kirksville. So maybe I'll do a
Mm,
land acknowledgement of God as opposed to the illiterate nomads, whichever ones they're trying to acknowledge. It just
mhm.
I could take on an ad in the newspaper. Actually,
There you go.
does
That's
the student newspaper accept advertisements?
I believe they do.
That's the best place to do it.
I don't think they'll accept your ad. I think they will
I,
deny it.
I believe that I will sue them. It's a publicly run organization, and they cannot do viewpoint discrimination as long as
Mm,
I'm not profane
mm.
or threatening violence.
There you go. There you go.
That'll be
To,
count
to get
two.
back to Montesquieu, I want to wrap up our section of Montesquieu. Then we can go into whatever your rant you're
Yeah,
about to go
well,
on
let's
to.
make our plans. Let's start
Yeah.
making plans.
So to wrap things up, to kind of conclude, Montesquieu's theory of political pluralism continues today. He says, this is very foundational, even going into the United States. He says, separation of powers must have the right social structure and a self-reliant population that vigorously uses the available institutions. That's very foundational for any, free government. He says, government is balanced because of continuous negotiations between individuals who have, institutional class and local loyalties, negotiations between people of different backgrounds. And by Montesquieu, it became clear that the path forward was not just mimicking the institutions of the ancients. However, Montesquieu used history and contemporary observations to understand the limits of possibility for the 18th century. And that's how we end our discussion on Montesquieu and on republicanism as a whole.
So what are your thoughts of Montesquieu and republicanism of this era?
Well, I really like Montesquieu. I think he hits on, a lot of what needs to be talked about a lot more, sort of, the values present in a civilization. I know you mentioned earlier that Josh Hammer came up to campus, and that was essentially, one of his main, points for any listeners out there who don't know who Josh Hammer is. He's a kind of a recent up and coming essayist, editor. And one of his main points.
He's the opinion editor of Newsweek.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Among other things, he's written for like all of the papers in the world, just about, or it feels like it. But one of his big, things that he's advocating for is national conservatism, sort of the idea of, re-examining, where we put values into the law, the non-existence, the lie of values neutrality, essentially. No society has ever existed that is just completely neutral to any values. Every society values something, and the people today who are claiming, well, we're just doing this, but it's not like an inherent value judgment. We're just doing this because, it makes sense, or it's, just natural to human beings. They're still making a value judgment, of course, targeting people on the left. But sort of this idea that, we need to look at the spirit of a country. What are the founding, principles, the motivating factors, the more value-based things that are in the society, and how do we make sure that those are present in our systems as they stand? And I think that's definitely something that should be focused more on going forward. What about you?
Yeah, it was good.
Thank you. I don't know, were you complimenting me or the book?
Both. No, it's a good summary of the great things about the writings of Montesquieu, and also these authors, they're right in my wheelhouse as far as what my beliefs are, and I'm just like more of that, and they're all right in their own way, I mean, I think, as you get into more details of it, and some of the thoughts are a little bit different than the way I viewed it. I viewed the separation of powers as exclusively structural, but the argument that you need a philosophical underpinning, belief in a separation of powers is almost, if not more important than the actual separation of powers, because we have separation of powers between the presidency and the legislature, but do we really have that in fact now? I mean, if you're in one party, it's just like one rolls over for the other. I mean, they're like, if you look now, you've got there's like really no accountability. Nobody's getting removed from office, as far as like impeachments or investigations, really, and that was true really of the Trump presidency too. Even though they're hostile legislators, there's like all the spending, all the stuff still just gets done, and I don't know what the solution to that is, because we don't seem to have a view that they have separate prerogatives, and you just let like Obama said, I got a didn't he the one that said I had a phone and a pen, so you just issue executive orders even if the Congress wasn't going to pass a law? Well, shoot, they should have impeached him for that nonsense. And any self-respecting legislator on either party should have said, no, that's unlawful and unconstitutional speech. I mean, not the speech isn't, but you're threatening to do something unlawful and unconstitutional, and you either apologize for it or we need to get you out of there. But the same is true of, Trump doing certain things by executive order, and of course Biden, that's all he's doing. But once you set that ball rolling, if you don't have that philosophy that there should be a separation of authority and responsibility, the courts have also ruined that thought about that they had a limited role. That's no longer true. They're starting to come back with a conservative majority, but they're going to have limits too, because there's so much the legislature and the executive is doing that's unlawful. They almost have to be an activist court
Mm-hmm.
to counteract it. Like, the student loan forgiveness, there was a district judge that it kind of didn't have, in a sense, didn't have a really correct ruling about standing,
Mm-hmm.
but the unlawful activities of the Biden administration required him kind of bypass all that and just issue a ruling on the merits, which has now been upheld by the circuit court. We'll see how far it goes up, but
Interesting.
you almost need a more activist court to rein in the other two.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So that thought,
Mm-hmm.
which I hadn't really been thinking of before I read this, but it's a really good point.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea that especially Montesquieu is getting at is like, you can technically have separation of powers, but if everyone in power holds the same values and doesn't disagree on anything, and especially if it's different than what the people hold as values, then there's no separation of powers at all. It's just them agreeing on everything, and they just go ahead and do whatever they want, ignoring the people entirely. It says, they have to follow the spirit of the people. And that's also what, Sidney was getting at too. A moderate king has to hold the same values as his people. There's no other way around it. If you're going to rule moderately, you have to hold the values of your people. If you don't, you are inherently like not moderate at all, because you're going against what your people believe. Even if you're doing it in moderate ways, through the separation of powers, through the system, if it's inherently against what your people believe, no matter what, it is not moderate, no matter what.
Truth. Yeah.
Yes.
Speak it. Yep.
Do you have any other, yeah. No. Do you have any other thoughts that we want to throw in here? I think we're wrapping things down.
Yeah, I'm out.
You're out. All right. Well, you can, of course, enter our t-shirt competition. Check the rules on our Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. He's rubbing his face in disgust. Leave us an interesting review, and you'll be entered into a competition to win a t-shirt. Email us or DM us on Twitter when you leave that review to be entered in. But I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
And this has been Unlimited Opinions.